Do you want to start with the gyrate, or just go to the lobes, or just whatever?
From top to bottom, please.
All right, so you want the noise in the background? Or
doesn't matter.
Okay. So when we look at the brain, we start with folds of gray matter, which are these gyri, separated by the grooves, which are the sulci. There's specific sulci and gyri that you need to know. So the deeper one is the fissure, and this is the longitudinal fissure. Okay. If we move in this direction, then we see the lateral sulcus, and that separates frontal lobe from temporal lobe, and a little bit of parietal lobe from temporal lobe. The central sulcus is right here, and that separates frontal lobe from parietal lobe. And then finally, on the medial surface, we see the parietal occipital lobe, and that separates occipital lobe from parietal. Okay. As we go through the individual lobes, I'll talk about the gyri that are involved with that. So, starting with the front, we have the frontal lobe, defined by lateral sulcus again, and the central sulcus. And then we have precentral gyrus, that's formed of the cell bodies of upper motor neurons, or the cortical spinal tract and cortical bulbar tract. Here we would have the premotor area. Short association fibers would lead from that to the precentral gyrus. We have the frontal eye cortex, which is involved in coordinating. So if I look to the right, both medial rectus and lateral rectus are going to turn together. We have the prefrontal cortex here, that would be frontal eye field. Prefrontal cortex, which is conscious decisions, logical thought, reasoning, personality. And then we have the basal forebrain, which is how we use that to form long-term memories, with long association fibers from our variety of our sensory lobes. This also, on the medial surface, is going to be the frontal lobe. Okay? This surface would be supplied by the anterior cerebral artery, whereas all of this surface out here till about here is going to be supplied by the middle cerebral artery. We move to the parietal lobe. We have the postcentral gyrus, which is going to be where our third order neurons end and interact with sensory neurons processing pain, touch, temperature, joint sense. And we have the associated association area that interprets that, and along with that, in this area here, we'd have Wernicke's area, which is how we understand language, which reminds me over here we have Broca's area, which is how we do our pre-planning for motor speech. Lateral sulcus and temporal lobe. Right here would be the primary auditory area where we process sound, and its association area where we recognize not what the words mean, but what the sounds are coming from and that aspect. Also inside the temporal lobe, in this region right here, we would have the hippocampus. And we can see the hippocampus. If we pull this up, we're looking at the lateral ventricle. And so down in the temporal lobe, we have the inferior horn of the lateral ventricle and the hippocampus. So that, as a structure, we associate with the temporal lobe. Occipital lobe, defined here by the parietal occipital sulcus, is for vision. We would have the primary visual cortex and association cortex, and that's going to be supplied by the posterior cerebral artery from our branch of our basilar artery. If we look at the medial surface, we see the corpus callosum, which are commissural fibers, and we can see examples of those commissural fibers if we look at this. Let's see if I get one here. Putting these two halves together. So this would be commissural fibers going from the right side to the left side, commissural fibers going from frontal lobe to frontal lobe. So gyri in the same lobes but opposite hemispheres. A short association fiber would be going, say, from this gyrus to this gyrus. So different gyri but in the same lobe, obviously in the same hemisphere. And then this would be a long association fiber going from different gyri in different lobes, but in the same hemisphere. Okay, and this is showing projection fibers, which are part of our sensory and motor, going up and down. One other lobe is the insula. It's not really a lobe, but it's a region, a cortical region that we see here as well. So this is also the insula. That's going to be supplied by the middle cerebral artery, and that's going to have functions in making moral choices, in making a variety of choices that require sensory input. So now let's move to the medial surface and look at the diencephalon. So below the corpus callosum, we have the septum lucidum and the fornix, and then we see the thalamus. So thalamus, hypothalamus, and pineal gland are the major structures of the diencephalon. With hypothalamus, we also see a bunch of other components as well. So I'm going to move over to this one, where we can see a little bit more of those. So here is a similar pattern. Actually, this one here. Show the same right to left. So this is our thalamus under the fornix. Fornix goes over the top. And as you can see, when we look posteriorly, we have a much larger component of the thalamus. The thalamus is primarily sensory cell bodies of third order neurons. So example, here's our optic nerve. And the optic tract carries visual neurons, second order neurons, back to the lateral geniculate nucleus. That's a part of the thalamus. Coming from the ear, the vestibulocochlear nerve is going to send information back to the medial geniculate nucleus for sound. So those are just two examples of specific nuclei formed of third order neuron cell bodies. Okay, so that's thalamus. Below the thalamus, we have the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus, within this area, has a great number of nuclei dealing with autonomic nerve control, reflexes for controlling fullness and thirst, a couple of emotions for rage and aggression. Growing out of the floor of the third ventricle formed by the hypothalamus, we would have the optic nerve. The part of the pituitary is a hypothalamic structure, and then the mammillary bodies. So if I put these two components back together, right here and right here, can you see it in there, are the mammillary bodies. So they are gray matter of the hypothalamus. They are connected to the hippocampus, which is this part of the basal nuclei, by the fornix. So not the blue structure, which is choric plexus, but this structure right here is the fornix. Okay, and we can see that here. This would be picking that up from there. Here's the fornix going over the thalamus, like you can see in this pattern here, going over the thalamus, and then heading anterior, slightly lateral to the midline of the hypothalamus and ending up in the mammillary bodies. So hippocampus and mammillary bodies are gray matter. Fornix is connecting white matter, like a long association fiber. So that's hypothalamus. And then the pineal gland is just above the superior colliculus and is involved in 24-hour rhythms, wake and sleep type cycles. I'll come back and do the ventricles when I'm done with all of the brainstem. So now we have the first part of the brainstem, which is the midbrain. So midbrain is going to be from here to here. Its ventral region is formed of the cerebral peduncles, and those are continuation of upper motor neurons coming down from the precentral gyrus and forming these large ventral bundles of voluntary motor neurons called the cerebral peduncles. We can't see it, but in the midbrain we would have the red nucleus and the substantia nigra, but those are internal. If we turn the midbrain over, we can see the superior and inferior colliculi, and these are the corpora quadrigemina. So we associate those visual and auditory reflexes are found with the midbrain. And finally, the superior cerebellar peduncles are part of the midbrain. And that's how the cerebellum sends information back to correct any slightly off movement when you're doing coordination and balance. All right, then we move to the pons. And so the pons is going to be this region from here to here. Back here we have a lot of cranial nerve nuclei and sensory pathways, but this is the basal pons right here. And that's the swollen part that we see. So our upper motor neurons are going to continue to pass through and into the medulla, but some of them will stop and synapse with pontine nuclei. That gray matter formed by the pontine nuclei is what makes this so large. Their axons pass to the cerebellum through this structure, which is the middle cerebellar peduncle. So we have superior cerebellar peduncle of the midbrain, middle cerebellar peduncle of the pons. Right? Then we move to the medulla oblongata. The medulla oblongata ventrally has the continuation of these upper motor neurons. So that's what forms the medullary pyramid, all the ones that did not stop and synapse with the pontine nuclei. And they form the medullary pyramids, and in the very bottom area of the medullary pyramid they cross over, and that's where we see the decussation, and then they continue down to form the lateral cortical spinal tract. All right, in the back, for both of these, pons and medulla, we see have the fourth ventricle. The cerebellum, which forms the roof of the fourth ventricle, as you can see here, has two hemispheres. So if I put this back like this, we see the two hemispheres, cerebellar hemispheres, and the central section in the middle is called the vermis. Okay? If we cut through the vermis, then we see the pattern of white matter known as the arbor vitae, or living tree. And that's just the appearance of that there. Cerebellum then receives its sensory input for joint position from the spinal cord via the spinal cerebellar tract in the inferior cerebellar peduncle. That's one of our cranial nerves, but it's just in the lower portion right here. That goes into the cerebellum. The cerebellum also receives sensory input from the eye and the ear. And it receives motor input for what we're going to do via the middle cerebellar peduncle. It takes all of that, spits out a change of plans, a change in the flight plan per se, and sends that back up to the cerebral cortex via the superior cerebellar peduncles. Okay, so we have three cerebellar peduncles, inferior, middle, and superior. One pair of cerebral peduncles, which are purely motor. All right, so let's finish up with the ventricles. So if we put this, back, we have the lateral ventricle here. There's two lateral ventricles, but we can see it on this side. We have the anterior horn of the lateral ventricle and the frontal lobe associated with the head of the caudate nucleus, which is part of our basal nuclei. That caudate nucleus forms the body, and then a tail, which forms the roof of the inferior horn. The floor of the inferior horn is our hippocampus. Okay? This would be the posterior horn of the lateral ventricle. So we're seeing anterior horn, posterior horn, and inferior horn. CSF is formed by the choroid plexus that we see here, which then passes through the interventricular foramina, which is going to come out here. And now we're in the third ventricle, formed by the thalamus and floor by the hypothalamus. More choroid plexus in the roof of the third ventricle. And now that CSF fluid passes through the cerebral aqueduct of the midbrain and into the fourth ventricle. From there, it can pass out the lateral aperture on each side. So if we bring this up here, we have the lateral aperture, and then we have a single median aperture. Both of them would come out to the sides or from underneath the cerebellum. Okay, finally, let's finish up with the cranial nerves. Put this back together here. So we have the olfactory bulb and tract, which is cranial nerve 1. And that leads back to several places. It doesn't go through the thalamus, but would go directly to part of the frontal lobe, part of the temporal lobe, part of the parietal lobe for interpretation, along with our facial and glossopharyngeal nerves for taste. We have the optic nerve, which crosses over to form the optic tract. So I'm going to switch over to this model now, which is a little easier to see. We just don't have optic nerve on it. So here would be optic nerve, cranial nerve 2, forming the optic tract, as I showed you earlier, going back to the thalamus. Ocular motor 3 is on the medial aspect of the peduncles. So that would be ocular motor 3 on each medial aspect of the peduncles, and then laterally the trochlear nerve. Okay? So that's 1 olfactory, 2 optic, 3 ocular motor, 4 trochlear, and now we have cranial nerve 5, which is trigeminal. Cranial nerve 6, which is abducens to the lateral rectus. And then we move laterally to cranial nerve 7, which is facial. Cranial nerve 8, vestibulocochlear. Cranial nerve 9, which is glossopharyngeal. And 10, vagus. And coming up from the spinal cord through the foramen magnum, the accessory nerve, spinal accessory, which is 11. And then we come back to the midline and we see cranial nerve 12, which is hypoglossal. These are just cervical ventral roots that are here. They're not part of the cranial nerve system. Okay?
Thank you.
You're welcome.